for being here for this conversation. I was just telling Gene here that this is his fault. He had requested a conversation on Christian theologies of war and peace, and then we thought, that's a really great idea. Would you be a part of it? So he will be a part as well as with Dr. Lee Barrett and Kevin Ressler. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But for those who don't know me, my name is Liz Fulmer. I'm one of the associate pastors at Grandview, and delighted to be in this conversation. It's a relevant topic, and there's a lot we can think about and a lot we can do as well. So just an overview of how this will go. We'll introduce our panelists, and then I'll ask some questions we have prearranged, and then open up the floor. So right in the center, we have that microphone. At your own bidding, you can get up and come and ask a question. If you need the microphone to be taken to where you are in the seat, just flag me down. I'm happy to do that. And we'll just keep on going till probably about 4:15. So that's just a little over an hour. Hopefully you received one of those loose leaf papers on the way in. Dr. Daryl Stevens was meant to be here today, but unfortunately had a conflict. So when I asked him if he would consider writing something, he wrote quite a lot, and has that document to give an overview of some varied Methodist ways of thinking about war and peace. On the back of that paper are 2 stanzas of poetry, lyrics from Carolyn Winfrey Gillette that we will use at the end of our time together to sing, to pray, to do what we do as church. So without further ado, Gene, would you start us off? Introduce yourself, tell us who you are, relevant background information, and maybe your faith background as well.
My name is Gene Miller. I guess we're on.
We're good.
I was born and raised in Pittsburgh. I'm still a Pirates and Steelers fan. My father taught Latin and Greek at the University of Pittsburgh. My mother taught French and Latin on and off at various locations. And I took German. I went to Thiel College in Greenville, Pennsylvania, which is about 75 miles north of Pittsburgh. Then I did graduate work at the University of Michigan and Penn State. And I taught European history for close to 40 years, 35 of them at Penn State Hazelton. And I have been retired for the last almost 18 years, and I keep saying I recommend it to everyone. My faith journey, I was raised Presbyterian. I went to a Lutheran college. I taught for a year at Moravian College in Bethlehem. I was married in the Catholic Church, and I've been a Methodist since 1983. Now, depending on your interpretation, I'm either very ecumenical or very confused. Is there anything else you'd like to know? Okay.
I think that's great. Lee?
Hello. I'm glad this is on. I'm Lee Barrett. I teach at Lancaster Theological Seminary of Moravian University on the Ann B. Barsinger campus. That's what it says on our letterhead. So I do have Moravian connections. I would also lay claim to being somewhat ecumenical. I was raised Baptist and became congregational in New England when I was in college, and then worked for Presbyterians for 14 years, was married to a Roman Catholic, and studied a Lutheran. And in Europe, everyone thought I was Lutheran. Was raised in New Jersey, don't hold that against me, but having learned to drive on the New Jersey Turnpike, I know something about war.
Hi, I'm Kevin Ressler. So I'm going to ask you all to clench your fists as hard as you can. I'm going to talk and I'm going to tell you when to let them go, but clench them as hard as you can. And then I'm going to open with a light Pennsylvania ribbing. I was in Pittsburgh this week, and I was at the Grand Wyndham, and you can, from the parking garage, you can see PNC Park where the Pirates play, and there was no one in the stands, so I figured there was a Pittsburgh Pirates game going on at that time. All right, now I'm going to say you can unclench your fists. Okay. Feel that feeling. There is no greater symbol for violence than a clenched fist. And I just want you to remember that once you have clenched a fist tightly and let it go, you feel residual pain. War, as we'll talk about today, does not end with the cessation of the violent acts. It reverberates moving beyond. So that's just a little activity to think about and to remember. So my background, I am not ecumenical. I am painfully Mennonite. My grandfather in Tanzania was the first Mennonite, indigenous Mennonite pastor in Tanzania to take over from the missionaries. He was the first Mennonite bishop in all of Africa to take over from the white Lancaster-based Mennonite missionaries. My grandfather on my paternal side, my dad's side, is what you would more traditionally presume a Mennonite looks like. They started conservative Mennonite, plainclothes wearing and all those. They were excommunicated because we used to pick pastors by lay, which meant that you'd bring the men out, you'd have Bibles, you'd have one that would have something hidden inside of it, a verse, and the men would come and they would choose, and whoever had the verse was now pastor for life, never to be paid. And that was the structure of how you, I know, aren't you happy now? Whatever you're getting paid starts feeling a little better when you hear that story. So my grandfather and my grandmother, when they got married, they were about 19 and 18 years old, felt called by God to plant churches in rural Ohio where there were not churches. And their church said, we weren't called by God, and you weren't selected to be a pastor. You will now repent and never speak of this again. My grandfather said, no, we feel called by God to do this. So they were excommunicated. So my background is one that is both deeply Mennonite and also is one of, I would say, trailblazers and individuals who go forth based on what they feel called to. I was on the phone with my dad driving to this. He said, sorry, I can't come. They live in Camp Hill now. He said, sorry, I can't come. He said, but I want you to know something that my dad used to tell me, and I don't think I've ever told you this before. He said a Christian should always be ready to pray, preach, or die. And Mennonites are pacifist historically, and I certainly am. And that is the willing to die part of that is necessary in some of this work. Real briefly, I will say, so I've talked about being multiracial, multinational. When I was in third grade, I got my first detention. In public school, you say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I refused to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And when asked by my teacher why, and told I had to, I said, well, I've got cousins all over the world, primarily in East Africa. And if I pledge allegiance to this nation and we go to war with that one, are you telling me that I would have to kill my own family before having any qualms with someone who happens to be from the same nation as me? And so that has been a coloration of my thinking and being since I was a child. I was in high school when 9/11 happened and when we began our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And at that moment, the things that I had thought of even as a young child became practical in how I had to live my daily life amongst classmates who knew I was one of very few in our school who was not pro all of that. My academic background, I have a Justice, Peace, and Conflict Studies major from Eastern Mennonite University, and also mostly studied theater and justice. And I have a Master's of Divinity from Lancaster Theological Seminary, where I teach a class adjunct every year called Church and Social Change. And I'll stop there for background.
Thank you. We have a lot to work with. Okay, so we're going to start with maybe a question just to help us orient ourselves in this conversation, because we're using terms that get used frequently that maybe we don't always define. So, war, peace, justice, what do these words mean? Lee, how about you start us off? What is war?
I'll start with war, because being from New Jersey, that comes natural to me. It has several different dimensions. One is it's always coercive. It's trying to make people, a certain group of people, do something that they otherwise would not want to do. Like extend their boundaries, pay taxes, pay reparations, be enslaved. So it's coercive. And it's corporate. It's not done by individuals, but by cohesive bodies of people. These days, often nation states, but sometimes non-state agents and tribes, gangs even. So it's collective. It's not just individuals hurting one another. And the coercion involves some sort of force, which can be military, it can be physical, but it can also be economic, it can be psychological. It can just be the pressure of public opinion. In a way, I think even Gandhi was engaging in war against the British Empire. Can be journalistic. So it's always, the key thing is making somebody do something they otherwise would not want to do.
Other panelists, if you want to say more to that, you may, or you can choose to move on to what peace means.
I would just add that it is active, but may not always be physically active. So to the point of economic warfare or psychological warfare, war begins once that sort of active coercion is attempted. And we'll talk about peace a little bit, I think, as well. But just to say that the wars that we think of when we say, like, oh, I'm having a war within myself, that isn't what we're at least talking about here from a phraseology standpoint, can help someone think about something. But it is one group trying to get another group to adopt or accept their viewpoint against their own will. And it's the active portion of that happening.
Okay. Gene, anything?
Just briefly, I used to teach a course called International Understanding, Contemporary World Affairs. And one of the things we talked about frequently was diplomacy, international diplomacy. And the definition of diplomacy at its most basic, and I think, I'm not sure, this may come from Henry Kissinger, who obviously knew something about it, was that diplomacy is the absence of war. But if you look more thoroughly, and this is along the lines of what Lee was saying, is diplomacy really the absence of war, or is it a different form of war? Diplomats are engaging with each other, not with guns and bazookas and so forth, but they are contesting with one another, and they're trying to achieve their state's national interest or whatever their particular goal happens to be. So it's that was always a thought that I found interesting.
Okay. Well, you bring up diplomacy, which brings up in my brain peace. So what is peace? Which is quite the opposite, actually, of what Kissinger is saying. But right. So how would you define peace?
I just wanted to follow up on that, where the German theoretician Clausewitz said that war was diplomacy by other means. But more recently, a Methodist ethicist with Mennonite leanings said that diplomacy is war by other means. Just to tie into of violence, of organized violence by states or other corporate groups. It's broader than that. It's not only the foregoing of coercion, It's also the establishment of some sort of harmony and justice. Well, I think a lot of people mistakenly think that if a peace treaty is signed and the belligerents lay down their arms, that is peace. That's just the beginning. That's just the minimal definition.
Yeah, my first job out of college, I did a year of Mennonite voluntary service, and I lived in San Francisco. I worked in Oakland for an organization called Pace Bene Nonviolence Service, which had actually begun in anti-nuclear bomb testing in Nevada, and then became a whole organization that taught various principles of peace, has a whole process, a whole training manual, and we focused on 4 areas. So it was education, nonviolence action, nonviolence awareness, and nonviolence communication. So what we often were very intentional about saying is that peace is active, right? Pacifism is not passive, right? These things that we think sometimes are the cessation of, the lack of, that's not peace. And so I would say, sort of succinctly, peace is the active endeavor to see the other as self, a togetherness, to see the humanity in one another, not the sort of human-based separations that we create along lines of ethnicity or tribe or nation state or those things. Peace is when we actively do something towards reaching out to the other as seeing them as ourself.
I would just, to build on what Lee mentioned a moment ago, I think there's a difference between peace and truce. They both represent the cessation of fighting, but a truce is obviously temporary. Peace is, at least ideally, not. Whether or not we have ever really achieved peace is questionable. Related point is that we read fairly frequently about the fact that there has been no war, or at least no major war, since 1945. Obviously, there have been some things that are a little more than skirmishes, as in Vietnam and the Middle East and so forth. But the question just occurs to me: do we really have peace during that extended period? What, more than 70 years now? And I would have to argue that peace is a kind of an elusive goal that is not generally reflected in reality of international politics.
And if I could just add to that real quickly, to think about, I gave a speech recently where my opening line was, I have spent my entire life in wartime, but I've never lived in a war zone. I was born in 1984, and there's a great, it's an older book now because I'm getting older, but there's a great book I read in high school by Gore Vidal called Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace. And it highlights all of these sort of skirmishes. Well, they're skirmishes from our perspective, right? So it's not a war if we don't have some level of significant suffering, right? Not enough people died in this thing from our side for us to consider it a war. But the people who are dying, the people whose economies, whose infrastructure is getting completely destroyed, would certainly consider it a war. So when we think about these terms, one of the things to always be cognizant of is from whose perspective are we speaking of, and are we seeing these actions and activities occurring? So Haiti, who we have continually been involved with our Marines, formally and informally for 100 years, would certainly feel that we're at war. But you ask most Americans, have we ever been to war with Haiti? They'll all say no, right? The same is true for pretty much all of Central and parts of South America from a United States to their perspective. And if we think about Africa, Africa apparently never seems to be at war, if you take it from the American perspective, right? Because it's not involving us, so we don't count it. But I think we have to think, and this is where economic elements of this really become at play, we really have to think about what are the consequences on whatever multitude of sides, one or one and many, is at play, and not abscond ourselves from the responsibility of the consequences of everything from how cheap it is for us to buy clothing to the ease of which we can travel to certain areas and others the State Department tells us to stop going to.
If I could add to that, even bracketing out the economic and medical consequences of war and just focusing on numbers of people who were killed in combat, a higher percentage of the world's population has died from combat after 1945 than from 1900 to 1945. So if you add together First World War, Second World War, and the casualties in that, more people have died in war. A higher percentage of the world's population has died in war since then. But they were small wars that didn't get much news coverage, at least not in the United States.
So I'm going to, no, go ahead.
Just a little historical perspective there. It's interesting to note that before 1914, more people during wartime than did, while wars were happening with the actual fighting, more people died from disease than did during actual combat. It wasn't until the 20th century and World War I that really began to change.
Wow. Wow. I asked one question so far, which is excellent. This is just what I was hoping for. So Lee, could you bring into this conversation our Christian history and different Christian ways of thinking about war and peace?
Yeah. Well, to use the word Christian is, to use the word Christian is slippery and ambiguous because there have been a lot of different kinds of Christianity. And starting in the Old Testament and New Testament themselves, there are a lot of different voices that say a lot of different things that are relevant to the issues of peace and war, and it ranges all over the map. Looking at parts of Hebrew scriptures, like the book of Joshua, and parts of Chronicles and Kings, and certainly Judges, it looks like the Bible is legitimating total war, including the complete genocidal destructions of populations, the Canaanite tribes. Yahweh in Hebrew scriptures sometimes gets angry with Israel when they do not slaughter all the men, women, and children, and instead allow them to live and take them as slaves. So there's that voice in the Old Testament, which many Christians have seized upon as a legitimation of war. As over against in the New Testament, some of the sayings and the behavior of Jesus, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, blessed are the peacemakers, a lot of that's in Matthew. So you get everything from holy war to maybe pacifism. And the history of Christianity has been just as variegated as that. Early on, it seems like pacifism of don't join the army, don't engage in military combat, and maybe even don't support the Roman state as much as you can get away with, may have been a very widespread, but not universal opinion in the early church. The early Christian leader Hippolytus refused to baptize any soldiers. Said, first you got to leave the Roman army, and you've got to repent publicly that you were ever in the military. But by 312, with the Emperor Constantine, Christianity became tolerated in the empire, and not only tolerated, but eventually the privileged religion, and finally the official religion of the empire. And at that point, defending the Roman Empire became an obligation of Christians. And at that point, the theologian Augustine developed what became known as just war theory around the year 400. And it's still going on. It gets modified, it gets things added to it, but it's still a very widespread Christian attitude towards war. And I'll just quickly run through some of its qualifications. A war is okay as long as you're not the initial aggressor. You got to be attacked first. And your cause has to be just. You can't be fighting a war for territorial advancement, to protect economic interests. To protect your population, that's fine. To protect human rights, that's fine. So the cause has to be just. It has to be a last resort. You have to have tried diplomacy, persuasion, conversation first. There should be non-combatant immunity. In other words, don't kill civilians. The only legitimate targets are military personnel. Another one is respect for the enemy. Don't humiliate them, don't ridicule them. If you kill them, give them a decent burial. Don't cut their heads off and put it on spikes. If they're captured, treat them decently. A just war must be declared by a legitimate government. I can't just go out here and declare war on Lidditz. I have no intention of doing that. But that wouldn't be a war because there was no authorized government or political body doing it. And yet another one is the means must be proportionate to the goals. So that, for example, don't nuke another country because they refuse to repay their loans to you. In other words, don't overreact. If you're going to fight a war, make sure that the amount of violence used is proportionate to the goal. And a final one that's been added lately is only go to war if there's a reasonable chance that you're going to win and win quickly. Don't engage in a war if it's going to be long, bloody, and the outcome will be in doubt. In the interest of keeping casualties to a minimum. Then going down the centuries, some Christians have embraced the notion of holy war, unfortunately, that sometimes the interests of our very religion, Christianity, legitimates military violence. That was used by Charlemagne in the 8th century to convert the Saxons. It was basically, he conquered them militarily and gave them a choice, get baptized or die. The Crusades are a standard example of that, where the popes gave plenary indulgences, that if you go on the crusade, all your sins up until that point will be forgiven, because we need to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims, and we need to push back the armies of Islam, and that also happened in Spain. And then in the 16th and 17th century, there were holy wars fought between Catholics and Protestants, and every kind of Protestant fighting one another on the grounds that their faith was true and people should be compelled to believe it, and heretics and heretical groups were a danger to individual salvation. So if you were Lutheran, it was fair game to go to war against Catholics and vice versa. Even Reformed Protestants going to war against Lutheran Protestants, and Anglicans going to war against everybody else. The only thing that everybody in Europe was agreed on, which was their ecumenical common ground, was that it was always okay to kill Mennonites.
It's true, because Anabaptists, the precursor to sort of Mennonites and all those groups, Anabaptists, when they formed in the 1520s to 30s, we had a sort of basic tenets. It depends where the origin point is, but there was a thing called the Schleitheim Confession, which had a number of points for us. It's the most close thing we have to doctrine in our entire tradition. One of those was a refusal to use the sword. And so as part of these holy wars, you would baptize infants, not just into the church, but into the state. And that's where you began to have your citizen roles and those things, roles as an ROLLS, and knowing who you had, because you could start to see what soldiers you would have. And the Anabaptists didn't baptize infants. And one of the main reasons they didn't was because they did not agree and consent to being part of the war machine. And so as a result, yes, we became targeted by everybody because we were stealing their soldiers.
Fair game. And lest anyone think that this is the holy war notion was a thing of the remote past. No, it wasn't. In the American Civil War, both sides described their war effort as a holy crusade on the part of the South because they thought that slavery was a divinely mandated ordinance from God and that any Christian commonwealth had to have slavery in it in order to be righteous. And the North, of course, thinking, at least the abolitionists, that slavery was an abomination and had to go. So both sides, interesting, right before the Battle of Gettysburg, both armies, the Southern and the Northern armies, had major revivals and were whipped to a frenzy by religious zeal. And then in the 20th century, of course, in World War I, everybody thought they were doing God's will and that their cause was divine. The Germans, the German army, the infantry troops had Gottmittens on their belt buckles, God with us. And Woodrow Wilson said that the purpose of the war was to make the world safe for democracy, but what's usually forgotten, as he also said, and for Protestantism. And right now, the Ukrainian war, in the view of some Russians, is a holy war that has been legitimated by the Patriarchate of Moscow to conquer the Ukraine, restore it to Russia and to Russian culture, Russian Orthodox culture, because Ukraine was getting a little too cozy with the secular, evil, liberal West. So the notion of holy war is by no means gone, and Putin right now is exploiting it. Last one, and I'll be very quick. It's a trickier one. It's a slippery one, called Christian realism, developed by Reinhold Niebuhr, a famous ethicist in the mid-20th century. Niebuhr was an advisor. He was an ethicist, taught at Union, New York, but was an advisor to several American presidents, including Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Roosevelt to an extent. Got his picture on the cover of Time magazine twice. I've never had my picture on the cover of Time magazine. I'm waiting, though. My career's not over. And Niebuhr had been a pacifist, but then he witnessed the rise of the Third Reich and the Japanese Empire. And he concluded that human beings are fundamentally sinful. They will act out of sinful motivations, and they will try to augment their power and their wealth by any means necessary if left to their own devices. That individuals are like that. When you put them together in groups, they're even worse. That nations are sinful. Nations don't have a conscience and will do what is ever necessary to get ahead in the world economically, politically, culturally. And so he went beyond just war theory and actually claimed that sometimes, as with the Third Reich, you need to get in a preemptive strike. You can't wait to be attacked. You can't wait to be the victim of aggression. If you see aggression coming, you should try to nip it in the bud. So he, early on in the 1930s, advocated for declaring war on Japan and Germany, long before Pearl Harbor. And that sort of shocked everyone. But he just said, that's the realistic thing to do. There are evil people and evil nations. In fact, every nation is a little bit evil, including the United States. And therefore, you have to use force, and sometimes military force, to protect your neighbor. He followed Luther on one thing, that Luther's critique of pacifism was, in regard to your own self, you have the right to turn the other cheek and to not resist violence, not resist evil. In fact, as a Christian, you have the obligation to love your enemy, forgive your enemy, and not fight back. But you don't have the right to do that for your neighbor. If your neighbor's attacked, you have a Christian obligation to defend your neighbor. And if you got a lot of neighbors who are being attacked, let's say like 8 million Jews, then you have an absolute obligation to do something to protect them, and that something might well be violent. That became known as Christian realism. He just said, let's be realistic. The world's an evil place, and to protect our neighbors, sometimes we have to use force to do it. And sometimes we have to be the first party to use force. So you ended up with at least 4 positions in Christianity: pacifism and nonviolence, and peacemaking. That's one. Then the next one is just war, and then holy war, and then finally Christian realism. All those are still kicking around. All those are still in the air. All of them are still being debated by Christians. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jean, would you bring into the conversation the offerings from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and how does his life and work relate to this theme of war and peace in our religious context?
Just a brief aside before I
Sure.
answer your question. Bonhoeffer was a student of Niebuhr. He studied with him for, I believe, a year at Union Theological Seminary in the 1930s, and certainly was heavily influenced by his connection with Niebuhr. Bonhoeffer was a Christian pacifist, certainly by inclination, by training, if that's the right word. But he was also a realist. He knew, for example, that, and it was fairly self-evident, that in Nazi Germany during the 1930s, if you get up on your soapbox and proclaim your pacifism, it's not particularly conducive to your longevity. So he was cautious about what he said and to whom he said it. His friends, his family, certainly understood that the Nazis were anathema to him. He had no sympathy at all for who the Nazis or what the Nazis stood for. He had absolute contempt for their ideology and for their policies and their aims. Probably the two most important components of the Nazis' worldview were racial anti-Semitism, I come back to that in just a moment, and expansionist militarism, or the preparation for territorial conquest and war. Now, by race, the Nazis, you have to go back to their racial hierarchy that they established, starting with the assumption that there is a master race or a superior race at the top of this hierarchy, and of course they felt that they themselves were right up at or near the top of the so-called Aryan race, and that everybody else descended from that in terms of they simply didn't measure up to the superior race. There were gradations of inferiority here. The Mediterranean peoples, for example, were certainly not considered by the Nazis to be on a racial par with the Nordic peoples, the German, the Scandinavians, and so forth. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were considered by the Nazis to be, quote, subhumans because of their racial inferiority. And, of course, at the bottom of the racial pyramid, if that's the right word, were the Jews. Now, another dimension of this is that Bonhoeffer, as war approached in the late 1930s, Bonhoeffer became aware that he would likely be called up for military service. He was young enough, he was 33 when the war broke out in 1939, and he was young enough that people of his age group were being drafted for the Army, for the military in the late 1930s. This posed for Bonhoeffer a serious dilemma. Obviously, as a pacifist, military service was incompatible for everything he stood for. And it would have been extremely difficult had he in fact been called up for him to become involved or to submit to training for the military. On the other hand, had he refused to do so, the almost certain consequences would be either being sent to a concentration camp or, more likely, the executioner's block. So that he realized that, again, this comes back to the point I made earlier about not speaking out about your pacifism. But Bonhoeffer was caught quite literally between the devil and the deep blue sea. Whatever he did, or at least he felt this way, whatever he did was probably wrong. He was rescued, if that's the right word, by Hans von Dochnani. Dochnani was a lawyer. He had a high position in the justice ministry of Germany, though he was by no means a Nazi. He also happened to be Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, married to Bonhoeffer's older sister, Christina. In 1940, Dochnani arranged for Bonhoeffer to be assigned to a position as a courier for an organization known as the Abwehr. The Abwehr was the Office of Military Intelligence. And this would have, and in fact did, keep Bonhoeffer from being forced into the Army because he had what was considered to be an important security position in the government. As a courier, Bonhoeffer's job or his responsibility would be to use his numerous ecumenical contacts. And he had contacts throughout Western Europe, Britain and Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, and probably other countries as well, to gather information for the Abwehr. And it was hoped not only would his life be saved and would he not face the military call-up, but that he could, at least in theory, provide a useful service to the Abwehr. In effect, Bonhoeffer would be a spy. However, there's another aspect to this. The Abwehr was, as I said, the Bureau of Military Intelligence, but it was also the nucleus of the emerging resistance movement in Germany to the Nazi regime. And so Bonhoeffer's role as a courier was really a cover for his and the organization's really important activity, and that was preparing for the day or the time when Hitler could be replaced or overthrown. So by being brought into the Abwehr, Bonhoeffer, though in theory working for international security and working to gather information for that organization, was committing himself to what would become a conspiracy to replace Hitler.
If I could just point out that his decision that it was morally legitimate, although it was still sinful, to try to remove Hitler was an example of what he had learned from Reinhold Niebuhr, that you have to be realistic. And yeah, killing Hitler's murder. That's bad. That's a sin. Shouldn't do it. But which is better, to kill one person or to allow millions more of Europeans and other people across the world to be slaughtered? So that was the Christian realism kicking in.
So I'm gonna address the question that often gets asked in this context. I'm gonna move it a little bit as well, broader. But so you grow up as a pacifist, and at some point, someone's gonna say, "Well, what would you do about Hitler?" It's the easy question. One of the things that I think is rarely talked about in whether it's sort of the Bonhoeffer and his group's supposition of replacing Hitler, or even just the theoretical question itself, is that it presumes that one individual is making decisions that the whole group doesn't necessarily agree with without that individual. So if Hitler had been removed earlier than when he ends up committing suicide at the end of the war, there's no assurance that a Joseph Goebbels, who becomes maybe in line, isn't even worse than Hitler. Because as we talked about at the beginning, sort of war is people groups versus people groups. So the answer to the question, what would you do about Hitler, is you have to work earlier in these processes of global issues than we often do, particularly from a perspective of peace. We too often allow the peace perspective to be one that's reactionary. Now a negative thing has happened. Now what do we do? How do we stop it? When you look at Germany and you look in the 1930s and 40s and what's happening in Germany, you can draw a pretty direct line to the Versailles Treaty and the way that the German people group were spoken of and talked about on a global scale. They were essentially told that they were an evil people beyond what everyone else was and had no value, and their literal government was sanctioned in a way that did not allow their nation to participate in the sort of global context of economies, right? So that, when we talk about war as coercion and beyond just military action, that is something that was happening by a group of nations against one nation that allowed that people group to be susceptible to a demagogue like a Hitler. When we think about today in Ukraine, Putin, the same thing can be said. Putin's been around for a long time, and we've known that Putin was problematic, and so did many Russian individuals within Russia. Have we as a nation and a group of nations, Europe, NATO, whatever you want to call, have we done things, this is not to excuse the evil of those individuals like Putin or Hitler, but have we done things that have allowed the conditions of those individuals to flourish in positions of leadership? And how do we then assess those actions that we took as nation states? So if you hear what Putin's saying, you've moved, after 1989, we gave up access to these areas, and then you move the NATO line, right? Not to say that's a justification for anything he's done, but it allows a narrative of him to talk to a people group and to influence their acquiescence to the violence that then he promulgates. And so one of the things that we really have to do, those of us who desire and love peace, is to be thinking today about what may happen in 10, 15, or 20 years because of how the coalitions of nations are treating certain people groups, making them susceptible through the way that we have economic decisions. And look at areas that we think of as unstable in Africa or in Central America, and look at how the textiles and the mills and how people are being paid and compensated and what their quality of life is. Are we setting the conditions now for someone later to come as a demagogue? And what is our responsibility today for what will happen in 15 or 20 years, which we'll wash our hands of and say that evil person is all to blame for this action? And where do we find our own culpability within these conversations in the longer term? Because we can't, as people of peace, just come in at the end, wash our hands of it and say, ooh, we had nothing to do with that, and now we don't think that they should be doing that. For Mennonites, it's really important that when we look at our history, we don't just say, we didn't really own slaves, and we didn't participate in any of these wars. Because most of those wars had opportunities for Mennonites to hire their neighbor to go fight in their stead. So we're just as guilty in that sense of the deaths of that person who we hired in our stead. We may not have owned slaves, but we certainly enjoyed the bountiful lands that were accomplished on the natives in these communities that then became our lands. So we've got to be able to accept our culpability in the final actions from what we did or did not do earlier in setting the conditions.
Kevin, I think you're right about any kind of responsible peacemaker should be on the lookout to see how are the seeds in a people, in a culture, being sown that will eventually lead to violence and conflict and hostility, and head them off, and everyone needs to assume responsibility for that, and there should be intervention. It's a different question is, what when those seeds have already sprouted? Then what do we do? You know, you're right, the Versailles Treaty set the stage for World War II. It was avoidable, but the way Germany and others were treated made it almost inevitable that there would be a further war. But once Hitler was in power, it's a different question. What do you do now? And so, yeah, we could have done things to prevent the rise of Putin, but now he's in power, and now he's vicious, so now what do we do?
Yeah, and presuming that's not rhetorical. So one of the things, the easy and cheap way out of this answer is to say, let's be cautious about how we treat Russians right now as we go through this and after this conflict. Because we are right now setting the conditions for what happens after Putin is out of power, whether he dies of old age in power or he's removed in some other. So one is always looking at the present moment you're at and starting the work. If I was to come up with a just peace theory, it would say, in the conflict that you are in right now is how you begin to address the next one. So one is to think about that, but that doesn't help us with right now. So I think there's an old Mennonite Central Committee poster that said, a modest proposal for peace, let the Christians of the world agree not to kill each other. Now there's an element there of exclusionary to Muslims and other things that is problematic in that statement, but how do we find ways of, ultimately, government and those who lead governments only do so with the acceptance of their populations, right? Otherwise, it's just a madman raving on the corner about their hatred and their views. So the German people, who have spent much of the last 70 years feeling guilty and making changes about how, right, banning the swastika, which we haven't done with the Confederate flag, and we see how that festers, right? So there have been things that have been done, but how do we get, even now, how do we get through, we're talking in a Christian community here, about groups who are using Christianity to state the justification for their leaders' actions that they then perform. How do we find those Russian soldiers who, according to our news media, are in Ukraine and not feeling like they have been truthfully told what this is for? How do we get them to lay down their munitions? How do we get the people in Russia to see that this isn't theologically part of that? How do Christians appeal to Christians? And I think one real good example when we think about this is the classic story of Christmas Day in World War I. There's a truce. And what is the basis of that truce? The basis of that truce is everyone saying, theologically, we cannot agree with any stretch of the imagination that today is a day that we can kill one another. How do we get to finding ways of actively, whether it's through Christians or finding ways through government or whatever, actively saying, no, disobey your commanders. Set down your arms, and if you are inside of that country, back to my grandfather's, always be ready to pray, always be ready to preach, always be ready to die. If you are able to see your theology as one in which your obligation to Christ is to die for justice and for shalom, then you will sabotage the factories, you will sabotage the economies, you will do everything that you can to protest and to boycott and eliminate the ability of that leader to do anything but rave like a madman at a mic, which I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I'm going to pull a Reinhold Niebuhr, and that's a wonderful long-term strategy, and it would include things like don't demonize Russians, and do whatever we can to create harmony, mutual understanding, empathy between Russians and folk in the former Soviet republics and us. And that's an arduous task, but it can be done, and it could start with Christians. But that doesn't address the problem of what do we do tomorrow about the fact that missiles might be rained on more train stations, hospitals, and schools, and that the death toll of children, non-combatants of all sorts will mount. It seems to me that's a different question. The long-term question is one thing that really needs to be addressed. And the short-term question of how do we minimize death right now is another and thornier matter. Right now we are at war with Russia. We're in an economic and public relations war. Not yet in a direct shooting war, although we are providing the weapons for the shooting. And so right now I think the ethical questions for Christians is, what sort of war do we want to be in that would save the greatest number of lives right now and long term? Zelensky keeps returning to that theme that every day that sanctions, higher sanctions, particularly from Germany and France on the importation of fuel from Russia, every day that continues, more and more children are going to die. What do we do about that? Is there anything we can do? So that's why I actually turn to Reinhold Niebuhr and try to figure out what's the best we can, and this is always nebulous and anybody's guess, but by trying to do a calculus of who suffers, who gains, who lives, who dies, which is worse? Having direct military confrontation with Russia right now, upping the sanctions, doing nothing, trying to do long-term peacemaking, but not direct intervention right now. Which of those would result in the least amount of human suffering? That's a hard thing to do, but from the perspective of Christian realism, that's what has to be done. But I do really want to applaud the point about right now we can do things, as was done under the Marshall Plan with Germany, to make sure that animosities don't fester, and they're starting to. Some of you may be patrons of Iron Hill Brewery in town. They used to have a very good beer called Russian Imperial Stout, and they got a lot of pushback from customers saying, I'm not going to buy anything that says Russian on it. So for a while they changed the name of it to Ukrainian Anti-Imperial Stout. But that sort of thing, and people throwing rocks at Russian restaurants and Russian food stores, those are the kinds of things for long-term strategy we can try to promote empathy. But there's also the short-term thing. How do we keep as many people alive as we can?
Well, and I would just say two really quick things. The first is we have a president who proclaims to be a person of faith, and I haven't heard one appeal to the Russian people on we have a common allegiance, right? So back to my third grade refusal to give the pledge. How do we appeal and say, hey, those of you, let us look at how we are in a common nation that is not a nation state. So one is when we're doing our diplomacy, why are we so afraid to appeal in ways that may actually meet the individuals? And the other one is just to point out that the realism perspective says killing more people will end killing more people. And what we simply know is that it will just kill more people. We don't actually know when or how it will end the violence. It is a presumption that violence will stop the violence without a surety that that will happen. And just to put this on us, a not long time ago, I mentioned that I was in a high school during the Afghanistan war start and the Iraq war start, which itself was positioned as a holy war in many ways by the American administration. And I remember my dad took me down to Washington, D.C. I was around 16, and as we were driving down to the protest, he said, "Kevin, this is kind of like a Mennonite rite of passage. Like, now you're becoming a man, a Mennonite man. You're going to protest a war." And I realized at that moment that it was a beautiful sunny Saturday, and I'm not sure we would have gone if it was cold and raining. And I realized, and I wrote a high school newspaper article about this that no one in my class liked, where I said, if on Monday we protest by refusing to go to work and reporting to our bosses that it should be marked as an unexcused absence, I am skipping work in protest. If we would have done that, we would not have gone to the war with Iraq. If everyone who was protesting on those Saturdays had simply refused to be part of the mechanisms of economic development, we would have found a different way. And that's when it's us and our people. I cannot say what the Russians can or should do. So it's a different question what we here can do there. But if we see ourselves as allegiant to Christ, a shalom Christ and a kingdom on earth here, and we as Christians refuse to participate in the war mechanisms, both the military action, but also the economies that develop that. Here in America, too many people are complaining about gas prices instead of demanding that we pay more in gas, knowing that none of our oil is coming directly or indirectly from Russia.
I think you're right that there's no guarantees that any sort of intervention, including assassinating Hitler in World War II, would lead to the desired outcomes, but there's no assurance of anything in human life. Sure. And nevertheless, we still have to make calculations and decisions. And I suspect, and I'm going to defer to you because this is your field, that in 1944, taking out Hitler and maybe his henchmen actually would have hastened the end of the war.
In 44, probably.
Yeah. Certainly, that's what the Abwehr believed. They assumed, and there's certainly some validity to the assumption that Hitler, being the all-powerful Führer, was so absolutely essential to the survival of the regime that eliminating him would have brought about its collapse. We'll never know that, of course, but it's certainly a valid theory.
So I'd like to open up the floor for other questions you might have to bring. I have pages worth that I could ask. So if not, we can just keep rolling. But wanted to turn the microphone to you.
You have spoken about the nuclear question, and I just wonder if you would speak to that, because that's one of the things that our government seems to say, well, we can't get involved because, you know, we have the nuke and they have the nuke, Russia, you know, and if we get involved, like with the no-fly zone, I just want you to know, if you would talk about that and what your opinions are. Thank you.
If I could start the conversation off, and I'll be brief. Of course, from the perspective of pacifism, no, no nukes ever. From the perspective of just war, also no nukes, because the means is disproportionate to the outcome. The outcome might be the destruction of entire populations, and nothing can justify that. So, no nukes ever. And there would be way too much non-combatant collateral damage, which means like dead civilians. So that's unacceptable. From the perspective of just war theory, no nuclear war could ever be just or justifiable. Christian realism would also shy away from it, but for a very different reason. It's that Putin, if anybody used nuclear weapons, the other side would probably retaliate in kind, and that would just escalate to total destruction. So there the rationale is, yeah, we shouldn't do a no-fly zone because who knows what that would trigger, because Putin might not be a rational actor anymore. He might not have the likely best interests of the Russian people in mind and he might do something really crazy and stupid.
Back in the 1970s, there was a theory called MAD, which stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. And it was, the idea behind it was that the great powers, the nuclear powers, primarily, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union, would refrain from nuclear war simply because they fully understood that mutually assured that they would be destroyed as much as the opponent would be destroyed. That was a kind of a tenuous way of maintaining peace, but it seemed to work, or at least there was no nuclear exchange, and of course has not yet been. Putin and some of his leaders have hinted rather darkly in the last few weeks about the possibility of well, maybe nuclear weapons are an option. I don't remember exactly how they said it. I can't really believe that they're serious, unless they're absolutely backed into a corner in some way, because. Sure, they could launch a surprise nuclear attack against the United States, but we certainly would have enough left over to do considerable damage to Russia if it came to that.
There's, in 2000, or during the Obama administration, when they did their war games around nuclear war, there's some understanding of what Russia thinks and most of the nuclear states think. They did a war game and a nuclear bomb was dropped, and the people representing the nation that had a bomb dropped on them decided not to drop a bomb back and see what would happen to the MAD theory, and the other side ended up quitting. They didn't know what to do. They tried this multiple times because there's an assumption that there's a rational action that is bomb gets dropped, you retaliate. And when they actually played the game out and someone didn't retaliate and continued to use other conventional means, they had no awareness. So one of the things that's interesting is we presume that MAD is true, and it probably is. But we also don't actually know, because the only time a nuclear weapon has ever been used is the United States, when no one else had one. And so it is all very theoretical, and really the thing that probably holds us is the fear of the unknown, and both that the mutually assured destruction, but also just we just don't know what happens. And so the question, and the thing that always creates fear from a governmental standpoint, is what happens when a non-rational actor gets a nuclear weapon? Because we can assume certain things about a rational actor, but we don't know what happens when a non-rational actor actually gets one.
And that's absolutely right. And since we've been talking about Nazis and Hitler, I want to do that again. There was a classic case of, at least from 1943 on, somebody who was a non-rational actor and actually said that he would rather see the German people destroyed than surrender. In fact, he said, if Germany loses, it deserves to be destroyed. And therefore, he continued the war way beyond any hope of victory. Fight to the last man till the bunker in Berlin. So there are precedents in human history where non-rational actors have been heads of state and have had military power at their disposal. So a calculation is right now, how rational is Putin?
Right. And the other thing I would just say specifically about Japan is I wonder if you asked Americans how many nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan, how many would say 1 and how many would say 2? Because we dropped 1, and Japan didn't surrender immediately like we expected. And there are elements of how Japan conducted war that was and I should frame this as non-rational to the way that we think. Doesn't mean that all actions are non-rational just because they don't make sense to us. And so for the Japanese, and from their perspective, that didn't lead to what we thought would happen rationally until we dropped a second one, and then they acted what we had expected initially. And so I just think that's always an important point too, is I think a lot of the way we teach that part of American history, because we have rightfully so some level of shame about what we did, is that we sort of try to get through it as quickly as we can. And so it's sort of like we dropped the bomb, they surrendered, and then we moved on. And now we were at the Korean War. Just for the people on Zoom, the comment was not unlike what Putin sort of said about going into Ukraine and being over within 2 weeks. And now we see with Putin, he clearly didn't have a plan for if that didn't happen. And that's where you enter in lack of rational wargaming.
Which is why Putin right now is so dangerous, because he has been backed into a corner. He doesn't know what to do. He can't simply evacuate from the Ukraine because he would lose all public support, or at least a significant chunk of public support in Russia, and he would look like an idiot and a weakling in the eyes of the rest of the world, and he doesn't want that to happen. So he's stuck, and he's beginning, I think, to act very irrationally. He's just lashing out. And he's got nuclear weapons. Have a nice day.
Just to build very briefly on something Lee mentioned a few minutes ago. The Germans in the 1940s did have some very prominent nuclear scientists who were working on and were tolerably close to developing their own nuclear weapons. But to my knowledge, or if I recollect correctly, Hitler and the Nazis downplayed the significance of it. So we can perhaps be at least thankful to the Nazis for something.
Seems to have embraced entirely Putin's theory, that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and he seems to have given his blessings to Putin. Putin has used the Russian Orthodox Church as a weapon, if you will. Is the church being used, or is it the opposite?
Yeah, it's being used by Putin. And just to for the sake of truth and honesty, 700 Russian Orthodox priests in Russia have signed a protest letter against the war. So the Russian Orthodox support for the war is not universal. There is a significant and vocal critical minority who are probably risking their careers, maybe their lives, by protesting. But yeah, Putin, I have no insight whatsoever into Putin's spirituality, but he seems to think, and maybe it's a charade, maybe it's just public relations, that Russia has a divine mission to prevent the secularism and materialism of the West from creeping into Russia, and that Russia has an obligation to defend Central Europe from the corruption of greedy, materialistic American and Western European culture. And this is from a guy who has lots of palaces and may be the richest guy in the world. So he may really believe that, or he may just be using the church to gain popular support and have a theological rationale for what he's doing. And the Patriarch of Moscow certainly has a vested interest in supporting Putin, because he wants to be the head, recognized as the head of the Ukrainian church, and that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church should be part of the Russian Orthodox Church, and he should be the overlord of it.
There's also another dimension to this. Remember that I'm a historian, not a theologian, so I can say this. But the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state have historically been very close. going back centuries, going back to probably at least the 16th century, maybe longer. And the exception to that, if you want to call it that, was that after the Bolsheviks, the communists came to power in 1917, they pushed the Orthodox Church into insignificance. Basically, they didn't formally outlaw it, I don't believe, but it had no real independence. But this closeness between the state and the church in Russia is age old, and what Patriarch Kirill, is that his name, I think, and Putin are doing now is basically continuing a long-standing tradition.
It goes back to the czars. And it changed a little during World War II when Stalin reversed the policies of persecuting the Orthodox Church on the grounds that he wanted a religion that would unite the country and fire up the troops to fight the Germans.
And just a fun, friendly reminder that Christianity is not inherently moral in its enactments. In America, we believe that it was moral to own slaves, universally until the Civil War, and then tepidly by some of the North, right? So we have that. Certainly the American right wing has been very intentional about cozying up to power from Billy Graham on through to today, and we have been evil in how we have treated issues of race, issues of sexuality, people within our communities, even today. And I think if there's one thing to think about too, because I like to try to make sure that we're contextualizing the other into ourselves. And if there's one thing that I think we should be mindful of is the ways in which are our conditions here going to presently, driven by Christianity, making our nation susceptible to leaders and individuals who would suppress the ability of individuals to be themselves and the rights of individuals from a literal legal right. We see that under assault today. And could we, the most powerful military in the world, end up invading other countries largely based around the fact that they are from a different religion? Oh, right, we've already done that. Would we consider using our economic power to suppress other countries? Oh, yep, we've done that. And so I have been bothered by the fact that there is so little reporting in America right now about African immigrants in Ukraine and the difficulties that they have had in leaving. We all have seen the beautiful, beautiful pictures in Poland of the train stations with strollers lined up for these white Ukrainian women and their white Ukrainian babies to have freedom, but we barely report the fact that Africans are still to this day stuck in Ukraine, can't cross the border. I read an article this morning that was just shocking in the way that we don't act as rational people when the story was talking about from an African woman from Nigeria and her challenge to get out. And it talked about how they continuously went to checkpoints, and the checkpoints were to check to see that there were no Russian infiltrators amongst those who were fleeing. It would seem pretty easy to assume that a black Nigerian is not a Russian trying to flee, and yet they're being subjected to this and held aside from being able to safely evacuate from Ukraine. And here in America, why are we not talking about that? Why are we not alarmed by that? Why is that not as much front page of the newspaper as is those who are also struggling to get out for other reasons?
Along those lines, on our southern border, Ukrainian refugees are getting admitted very quickly, way ahead of Latinx people who have been sitting there for a year. So the Ukrainians jump right to the head of the line. Now, why is that? And to underline something Kevin said, that religious nationalism is widespread, and we can't just point to the Russians as the evil people. If you want to see Christian nationalism, read the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Yeah. We have seen him, meaning Jesus, in the gleaming of 10,000 bayonets. You know, frankly, I've never seen the face of Jesus in a bayonet, but
So I think we often do get caught up in the questions of the moment and trying to solve the problem when it's really hard to solve. I think there's something really more realistic than Christian realism and some of what Kevin is describing about, well, we can't fix that right now. Maybe we can't just assassinate our way out of the problem, probably, but what can we do? So I would love to hear more conversation about, like, what can we do in this moment, and this turn to a conversation about refugees is part of that, I think. Like, very often we set narrow limits on who can come and how quickly they can get here, but just letting people get out of the way of war is a really important peace act. So are there other things that Christians proactively can support if we are about peace and would prefer not to do war? And I just also want to just comment briefly on the just war thing. As you were reading, like, those criteria, I was reflecting that we've never had a war in my memory and before my memory that meets those criteria, but just that's a well-known term, just war, that people say as if there is such a thing, but I have not seen such a thing. Even World War II doesn't meet those criteria. So, yeah, so what can we do if we care about peace that is realistic and, yeah, prevents situations, but also does try to address the suffering, for instance, of the Ukrainian people right now?
A couple things. I might disagree about one thing about World War II.
But can I just also say, not just the Ukrainian people, you know, we're right now resettling a family from the Democratic Republic of Congo who's been in a refugee camp in Tanzania since they were, the parents, since they were children.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I wouldn't want to discount the possibility that there might be a just war. And I think World War II was, except for the non-combat immunity part, because, we firebombed Dresden and we eradicated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What can we do? I hope this doesn't sound namby-pamby, but I think what we can do is what we're doing. More people, it seems to me that millions more people will die unless territorial aggression is stopped. And the world needs an example of the fact that this is just not to be tolerated by the community of nations or by anybody. That you can't just go to war because you want to expand your territory and you want an outlet to the Black Sea and you want a land bridge to the Crimea, or you want to spread Russian culture throughout Eastern Europe. That's just not acceptable. The difficult thing is how to oppose that, and I think it does require force, military force. How to oppose that without triggering a broader, unending conflagration, particularly nuclear war. What to do with the folk who are dispossessed, and what to do with the Ukraine when the war is over, and it might, who knows when it'll be over, but presumably someday it will be. It seems to me that all the nations of the world need to band together, the UN, the European Union, every other organization, to relocate, provide health care for, retrain, get jobs for the refugees. And the United States, being the wealthiest nation in the world, that responsibility falls on us in a big way. And after that, this is something not many folk are really thinking about. Ukraine is going to have to be redeveloped. There's going to have to be something like the Marshall Plan, just a massive dumping of money, resources, time, energy, personnel into rebuilding the agriculture and the industry of the Ukraine and the infrastructure, which has been largely destroyed. And lots of post-traumatic stress disorder therapy for the Ukrainians, their children. It's going to be massive.
On a super sort of practical level, I agree with what Lee's talking about on the rebuilding. But I also think we want to think very intentionally about whether or not refugees stay refugees. I've studied in Palestine and Israel and Middle East in college and have spent a lot of my life focused on that area. And one of the things that, you have problems today because there was a war or series of wars, and there were refugees, and they were never let back. And so you create multi-generational problems because you have people who have an identity that is actually kept because you're a refugee. So if you're an immigrant, you may choose over time to assimilate and identify with the group that you now physically reside in. But when you stay a refugee, you always maintain primary identity with where you originally came from or your ancestors originally came from. And so I think we want to be very careful about finding ways of redeveloping and then putting people back. I mean, it's in Russia's interest, frankly, that there's a whole bunch of refugees who don't come back, because then in 5, 10, 15 years, there's less individuals there. It makes that, what they're trying to do today, easier. On a local level, and this will sound counterintuitive, but stop voting in your own self-interest. And I don't mean that in the way that, like, there's a book, Kansas Doesn't Vote. Why does Kansas not vote in their own self-interest? So I don't mean it in that sense, but I mean literally vote in the other interest. We don't have right now a federal government that has an appetite even for the type of rebuilding effort that was just proposed. We don't have a government in this, we're not going to talk about, but I was going to talk about the internal wars of the United States on poverty, which is our government literally going to war against poor people, not to help them, but to provide a base to which the country feels okay with. When I used to run Meals on Wheels, it was always interesting that the federal government provides enough funding for 1 meal and a half Monday through Friday. Nothing on Saturday and Sunday, nothing in the evening. Why? Because they're just stemming a starvation crisis amongst seniors. They're not trying to provide them nutrition or assistance. So the way that our government has had a war on poor people, war on black people, often called a war on drugs, right? So we need to have a government that we push through our expectations, our voting, our advocacy, that says, my taxes being the absolute lowest that they can possibly be is not in the best interest of my community. And it is not what I'm voting for. I'm not voting for wasteful taxes either, but use our communal resources to develop our community. And those same type of legislators will understand being a part of the global context and not having our total aid package from USAID being less than 1% of our budget. But how often do you hear politicians running about how much money we spend sending over around the world? But our military budget is half of our budget, and we ask for more.
I agree with what Lee was saying a few minutes ago about the reconstruction of Ukraine. But there's something that to me is to say the least bothersome. Yes, I think the United States, the European Union, and many other countries will have to pitch in to help Ukraine to recover, and it's going to be a formidable job. There must be $500 billion at least of damage that's been done to Ukrainian infrastructure to this point, to say nothing, as you suggested, about the mental health of the people who've been forced either to flee the country or at least relocate inside the country. But there's to me, it would be kind of hard to reconcile with the concept of justice if Russia is not somehow forced to contribute to this rebuilding. If they are to if the West and the rest of the world says to the Russians, okay, or to the Ukrainians, we will help you rebuild, and the Russians are allowed to sit on the sideline since they caused all of the damage, there's something wrong with this picture. The second thing that occurs to me, and it's not entirely related, but I think it's related. We are conducting, as Lee suggested earlier, economic warfare against Russia. And short of actual military conflict, it's about the only option we have right now to try to force the Russians to back off. But who's being hurt by this economic warfare? Is it Putin and his clique at the top? Probably not. Much more likely the 140-odd million Russian citizens are the ones who are going to end up paying for this, and they really already are. I don't have an answer to that problem, but it is a concern.
Well, one other thing, Kevin's remarks about things we can do that would hurt our lifestyle and our prosperity and our sense of economic well-being that we could do to ameliorate the situation. One obvious thing is don't use as much fossil fuel. I mean, we shouldn't do that anyway, but now we have several other reasons for not doing that, because if it is the sale of natural gas, oil, and to an extent coal that fuels the Russian war machine. And if people just didn't drive as much, Russia wouldn't have as much income.
Yeah, it's like 70% of their economy is based on non-renewable resources. And I would just say to Dr. Miller, I fully agree on the Russian people are the ones who are harmed, and that's where I think about what conditions are we setting up. If not framed correctly, those are the areas where the next, even after Putin comes in and says, look what they did to you.
I don't know if any of you ever read a famous novel by Erich Maria Remarque called All Quiet on the Western Front. And there's one very interesting scene in there where the German soldiers are talking among themselves and trying to figure out how they got into this mess. And they basically, one of them says, so, the wrong people are doing the fighting here. It should be if the leaders, if the generals and the politicians want a war, they should get into their shorts and fight with each other. We didn't want a war. We're not we're not interested in killing each other. Let them do it.
Well, I've been a poor moderator because we've gone over time, and I tend to try very faithfully to follow the time well. But I do guess, to put you all on the spot, that if there are lingering questions, maybe you'll hang around for a little bit for conversation. Okay. But just for other people who might have other obligations or time, why don't we pray? That feels like something we can do and should keep doing. So if you turn over the sheet that you received on the way in, I'll invite you to sing that prayer. The tune will be familiar to you. I'm blanking right now on the name of it. Thank you, Finlandia. So we'll sing that and then maybe invite some informal conversation. Is that okay for a bit? Okay. First, before we pray, thank you very much for... Yeah, thank you. Here we go. Let's pray. We pray for peace, O God of love and justice, as once again we face a time of war. The meek and humble Take